ready to spill the tea because I am taking you behind the velvet rope to reveal the juicy secrets from the 7 wild years we spent shooting over 150 episodes of The Dukes of Hazzard. It was a chaotic scene of screaming tyres, flying dirt, and that iconic wheezing laugh that echoed across the set. Goo, goo, goo! To the adoring public, James Best was simply Rosco P. Coltrane, the bumbling, hilarious sheriff endlessly chasing the boys through Hazzard County. But back in 1979, this seasoned lawman did something absolutely unthinkable in the entertainment industry. He walked off the set. And no, it wasn't about seeking fame or demanding a massive salary hike. Would you believe that he actually quit over a filthy puddle of mud and a missing chair? This is the shocking, untold story of a true Hollywood rebellion. So why exactly did the sheriff throw down his badge in a fit of rage? To understand the scandal, we first have to peel back the layers of the man wearing the uniform and examine his impressive pedigree. We are talking about a classically trained Shakespearean actor trapped in the backwoods of Hazzard County, a total clash of cultures. To the casual observer channel surfing in 1980, James Best seemed like a simple guy who had spent his entire existence tumbling off haystacks and having conversations with hound dogs. He portrayed Rosco P. Coltrane with such a rubber-faced, hyperactive energy that you would swear he had a background in vaudeville or had spent a lifetime clowning around in the circus. However, the reality of James Best was far more sophisticated, complex, and quite frankly, far more intimidating than his on-screen persona. The moment he parked that patrol car and wiped the Georgia red clay from his brow, the act dropped. He was absolutely no dipstick. He was actually one of the most respected technical actors in the entire industry. Born as Jewel Franklin Guy in 1926, Best's early life reads like a dramatic Southern Gothic novel in the making. Tragically orphaned at the tender age of 3 in Kentucky and adopted by a family in Indiana, he grew up with a massive chip on his shoulder and a restless, fiery spirit. He didn't discover his true calling in some local comedy club. He found it deep in the belly of a B-17 bomber during the height of World War II, serving as a gunner and radioman. Best faced the kind of terrifying life and death stakes that make a modern Hollywood tough guy look like a spoiled child playing in a sandbox. When the war finally ended, he didn't just head back home to settle for a quiet blue-collar trade like everyone else. Instead, he stayed behind in Germany and joined the army theatrical troupe, immersing himself in the art of performance. It was right there amidst the rubble and ruin of post-war Europe that the man who would become Rosco discovered he possessed a sheer genius for the method. By the time he arrived in Hollywood, Best was already a powerhouse. Let's be clear, we aren't talking about some lucky guy who stumbled into a sitcom role by accident. James Best was a legitimate veteran of the golden age of westerns and noir, sharing the screen with cinematic giants like James Stewart in The Naked Spur and Humphrey Bogart in The Caine Mutiny. He was a frequent, intense guest on The Twilight Zone, often playing characters with a dark, brooding intensity that would completely shock a typical Dukes of Hazzard fan. He was a total chameleon, a man who could effortlessly shift from playing a cold-blooded killer to a tragic hero without breaking a sweat. But his most impressive serious credential wasn't just his own acting chops. It was his legendary status as an educator. It was his incredible ability to teach the craft. James Best ran one of the most prestigious and exclusive acting schools in all of California. This is the man who helped shape the craft of absolute legends. He was a mentor to Quentin Tarantino, who would later openly praise Best's deep, intuitive understanding of cinematic movement. He coached A-list superstars like Burt Reynolds, Clint Eastwood, and the iconic Farrah Fawcett, refining their talents. When top-tier actors wanted to know how to completely own a scene without uttering a single word, they went straight to James Best. So you have to ask, how does a man who teaches Shakespeare and the method end up playing a sheriff who gets outsmarted by a lethargic basset hound? The answer lies in Best's own intense creative restlessness when he was cast as Rosco P. Coltrane for the 1979 pilot of The Dukes of Hazzard. The character was originally written as a mean, crooked, and rather boring local lawman. In fact, in the first few episodes, Rosco is actually quite grounded and completely forgettable. But best ever, the intellectual artist realised immediately that a genuinely mean sheriff wouldn't last 3 seasons on air. He knew intuitively that if the audience hated the antagonist too much, the show would lose its light-hearted Robin Hood-style appeal. Using his vast encyclopedic knowledge of character archetypes, Best made the executive decision to cartoonise the law. He reached back into his own childhood memories and pulled out the voice of a bumbling kid playing a game of cops and robbers. He invented that signature coo-coo sound as a subtle way to signal to the audience that Rosco wasn't truly evil at heart. He portrayed him as just a big kid playing a game he could never win, adding the scuffing of the feet and the cackling sounds to fill the dead air. He effectively transformed a flat 2-dimensional villain into a 3-dimensional comedic icon that stole the show. However, this brilliant transformation created a serious psychological friction behind the scenes. On one hand, Best loved the creative freedom the producers gave him to ad-lib. On the other hand, the serious, disciplined actor in him was constantly at odds with the production's shocking lack of professionalism. He was a man who deeply respected the craft, a professional who came from the era of big-budget studio discipline and rigour. He expected a set to run with the precision of a Swiss watch, especially for a show that was pulling in a staggering 30 million viewers a week. Instead, he found himself on a chaotic set that treated the human actors as secondary props to the stunt cars. He watched with disdain as the Duke boys, John Schneider and Tom Wopat, were treated like replaceable heartthrobs rather than respected collaborators. He saw a greedy production office that was getting rich off lunchboxes and toy cars, while the veteran actors were expected to change their clothes in the back of trailers that leaked when it rained. The intellectual gap between the talent and the executives was widening, and a major explosion was inevitable. Behind the scenes, the man was actually a closet intellectual, spending his downtime brushing oil on canvas and penning verses like a tortured soul, totally disconnected from his on-screen buffoonery. But come Monday morning, it was pure degradation. His week involved trading the paintbrush for a face full of stagnant swamp sludge, humiliating himself just to get a chuckle out of the viewing public. Sure, he loved hearing the kiddies laugh and adored the fans, but the indignity was eating him alive. Imagine a classically trained thespian forced to clown around in what felt like a redneck demolition derby run by sadists. The suits upstairs at Warner Brothers looked down their noses and saw nothing more than a washed-up 50-something character actor who should have been kissing the ground for a steady gig. James Best, however, saw a seasoned pro who had paid his dues 10 times over now being forced to endure working conditions that would have made a rookie extra walk off the set back in 1950. It was a ticking time bomb, a classic Hollywood ego clash between a star with standards and a production team cutting corners on basic human decency. Everyone on the lot knew the explosion was coming. It wasn't a question of if the legendary lawman would snap, but exactly when he would tell the bosses to shove it. While Hazzard County was printing money for the network execs, the cast was being treated like indentured servants, digging through the mud while the studio counted their gold bars. Enter the infamous muddy ultimatum of 1979, a scandal that rocked the humid, high-stakes world of 70s TV production, where the suits lived by a ruthless code. In their eyes, the intellectual property was the king of the castle, and the actual talent were just disposable tenants lucky to have a roof over their heads. For the Dukes brand, the real star was that flashy orange car and the adrenaline of a backroad chase, not the people reciting the lines. The flesh and blood humans buckling up inside were seen as totally replaceable spare parts, but they failed to realise that James Best wasn't just a cog. He was the comedic engine powering the whole vehicle, and he was getting ready to teach them a brutal lesson even the most well-oiled, money-making machine grinds to a screeching halt when you treat the operator like absolute garbage. This backstage feud didn't start with a shouting match, it started with a soak, because filming this hit show was less like acting and more like surviving a boot camp. Forget reciting Shakespeare, the job was about choking on the dust of Santa Clarita and sweating through the suffocating, swampy humidity of those early Georgia location shoots. As the bumbling Sheriff Rosco Best was the production's favourite punching bag, constantly subjected to physical humiliations that would make a stuntman quit. We are talking about being tossed into filthy lakes covered in greasy engine soot and routinely marinated in the thick, stagnant muck of those roadside ditches. By 1979, the show wasn't just a hit. It was a full-blown cultural phenomenon that took the world by storm. The ratings were going through the roof and the merchandising machine was printing millions of dollars in pure profit from lunchboxes to toy cars. Yet, despite all that cash flowing in, James Best was essentially being told to roll around in the filth like a pig without so much as a hose to clean himself off. The spark that ignited the most notorious walkout in the show's history was shockingly petty and completely avoidable. It all went down when Best was ordered to perform a humiliating stunt that left him completely caked in slime and grime from head to toe. When the director finally yelled "cut," the star trudged off expecting basic amenities, maybe a warm shower or at least a private dressing room with running water to scrub off the stench. Instead, he was slapped in the face with the cheap reality of a budget-conscious set that refused to spend a dime on actor comfort. There were zero facilities for him. The production assistants basically told him to suck it up, wait it out, or spray himself down with a freezing cold garden hose behind a trailer like a stray dog. For a guy who had rubbed elbows with Hollywood royalty at MGM and Warner Brothers during the Golden Age, this wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a slap in the face. It was a massive professional insult, a sign of total disrespect for his craft and his seniority in the business. He looked at the fat cat executives getting rich off his signature giggle and realised they couldn't care less if he sat in wet, rotting clothes for 12 hours straight. But Best didn't throw a stereotypical Hollywood hissy fit with screaming and chair throwing. He processed the disrespect with the icy, calculated logic of a military veteran. He calmly issued a demand for a hygienic dressing room with a working shower, a standard honey wagon that met the bare minimum requirements of human dignity. The studio's response, a bureaucratic shrug and a sneer, convinced that this aging actor needed the paycheck way more than they needed his talent. They arrogantly asked themselves, "Who is James Best without the sheriff's badge?" And boy, were they about to get a rude awakening. Best stared down the production staff, spun on his heel and didn't just retreat to his trailer. He left the lot entirely and went straight home. The muddy ultimatum was officially on the table and his terms were crystal clear to anyone listening. He vowed he would never step foot in Hazzard County again until they gave him a shower and a place to rest that wasn't a cheap folding chair in the dirt. To the suits chilling in their air-conditioned ivory towers in Burbank, this looked like a diver power trip, but to Best, it was a righteous labour dispute. At 53 years old, with a resume miles long, he was absolutely finished being treated like a clueless stunt dummy who didn't know his own worth. Warner Brothers decided to call his bluff, assuming that once the bank account started looking empty, the sheriff would come crawling back, begging for his badge. What they failed to calculate was that James Best was a man of ironclad principles who had plenty of other hustles to keep the lights on. He had his own acting school, his lucrative art career, and a lifetime of savings tucked away from decades of grinding in the industry. He didn't need the show. The show desperately needed him, and the standoff quickly turned into a bitter Hollywood Cold War. The studio panic scrambled, sending out casting calls for substitute lawmen trying to prove their arrogant theory that the formula was the star, not the actors. They dragged in a revolving door of guest stars to plug the massive hole left by the sheriff, but the magic was clearly missing. Meanwhile, Best sat comfortably at home, painting masterpieces and teaching students, refusing to even pick up the phone unless the caller was ready to talk about plumbing and respect. It was a legendary, visceral public demonstration of a serious actor drawing a line in the sand and refusing to be treated like a studio doormat ever again. That dried mud caked onto his uniform wasn't just a costume detail anymore. It was a gritty symbol of his hardened resolve to fight back against the disrespect. While the frantic executives were running around like headless chickens, desperate to doctor the scripts with a lame cover story about a law enforcement convention, the fans out there started smelling a rat. The show had essentially lost its soul overnight. And what started as a simple puddle of backstage drama was quickly morphing into a massive sinkhole threatening to swallow the entire billion-dollar franchise. James Best walking off that set wasn't just a temper tantrum, it was a landmark rebellion that sent shockwaves through the industry for every character actor in Hollywood. Get this, he wasn't holding the studio hostage for $1 million raise or a fancy trailer. The man was literally just fighting for a folding chair and a place to wash the filth off his body. He was going to war for the basic human right to be treated like a professional thespian rather than a disposable prop they could just toss in the dirt. By storming off the lot, he ripped the curtain back to expose the dirty little secret of TV production. The stars who bring the magic are often treated with less dignity than the catering staff. But when the sheriff turned in his badge, the studio didn't offer an olive branch or an apology. They coldly turned around and went shopping for a cheaper replacement. Thus began the infamous Great Sheriff Drought and a fan revolt that would go down in history. But initially, the arrogant suits at Warner Brothers didn't even break a sweat when Best walked. They were completely unbothered at first because inside those plush boardrooms, the philosophy was ice cold and purely calculated by the numbers. In their minds, the show was strictly about a flying car, two good-looking cousins, and a girl rocking famous short shorts, assuming the guy in the tan uniform was just background noise. They arrogantly believed that as long as they slapped a badge on a warm body and turned on a siren, the millions of viewers watching at home wouldn't notice who was actually behind the wheel. It turned out to be a corporate miscalculation of catastrophic proportions that would nearly derail the entire series. The studio's brilliant strategy to patch over the disaster was to install a revolving door of substitute sheriffs, hoping nobody would spot the difference. They started trotting out replacement characters like Sheriff Grady Bird, played by Dick Sargent from Bewitched, and Sheriff Booster Rogers, brought to life by James Hampton. On paper, these guys were industry veterans with solid resumes and comedic chops. Professionals who hit their marks and didn't make a fuss about the lack of showers on set. But the second the cameras started rolling, the problem became so glaringly obvious it was painful to watch. The set felt completely hollow without the original star. The disastrous Sheriff Drought of Season 2 kicked into high gear and the entire vibe of the show shifted from organic, lovable chaos to forced, cringeworthy slapstick. The poor substitutes tried their hardest to mimic the energy, but they completely lacked that lightning-in-a-bottle madness that Best had spent months meticulously perfecting. They were just actors playing the role of a sheriff, whereas Best was inhabiting the soul of a man who had completely lost his mind chasing a Dodge Charger. The nuance was vanished, and that signature cuckoo insanity wasn't something you could just teach a guest star in an afternoon rehearsal. That manic energy was a direct manifestation of Best's own eccentric genius, something that couldn't be scripted or cloned. Even more devastating, the departure of Rosco absolutely nuked the show's most vital comedic engine, his bizarre codependent relationship with Boss Hogg. Sorrell Booke and James Best had developed a comedic shorthand that bordered on telepathic connection, and without Best there to bounce off of Booke, looked visibly lost on screen. Those legendary scenes in the back of the white Cadillac, once the comedic gold of every episode, now felt like a sad, lonely monologue. Boss Hogg suddenly had no one to bully who could react with that perfect magical cocktail of sycophancy and utter stupidity. The little fat buddy dynamic was officially dead in the water, and with it, the beating heart of the show stopped, leading to a swift and merciless backlash from the public. You have to remember this was 1979, an era long before Twitter mobs, but the Dukes of Hazzard fanbase was a vocal and powerful tribe you didn't want to mess with. The mailrooms at Warner Brothers were absolutely flooded with angry letters, and they weren't asking about Bo or Luke. They were demanding to know where their beloved sheriff was, because kids across America weren't buying the fakes. The rating numbers, which had been skyrocketing vertically, suddenly hit a ceiling and began a terrifying nosedive dip that panicked the network. For the first time in its run, the unstoppable Dukes machine looked vulnerable, and this drought proved a fundamental truth about the television business. You simply cannot replace genuine chemistry with a script. The fans didn't just want a crooked cop character, they wanted that specific crooked cop. They missed the peculiar way Rosco talked to his basset hound Flash, and the way he would childishly scuff his heels on the ground when he got excited. They missed those weird, high-pitched cuckoo sounds he made when a scheme worked. The substitute sheriffs were just actors in costumes, totally void of the magic. James Best was Hazzard County's favourite disaster, and inside the studio executive offices, the tone shifted rapidly from smug arrogance to sweaty desperation. The suits finally realised they weren't just losing an actor over a shower dispute, they were losing the trust and loyalty of their entire viewer base. Every single week that Rosco remained at that fictional law enforcement convention, the show's flimsy excuse for his absence, the brand lost significant value. The merchandise and toy sales, which were the real financial bread and butter of the franchise, depended entirely on kids wanting to play as Rosco and Flash. Let's be real, absolutely nobody was begging their parents for a Sheriff Grady action figure for Christmas. Meanwhile, Best was watching the chaos unfold from the sidelines with the quiet, smug satisfaction of a man who knew exactly what he was worth to the machine. He wasn't even being malicious about it. He was simply proving his point while he continued to paint and teach his acting students, waiting for the inevitable phone call. He knew the golden rule of Hollywood better than anyone. Ratings are the only currency that actually matters in this town. When the numbers finally crashed and burned, the studio's so-called principled stance against providing a simple shower suddenly seemed incredibly expensive and foolish. That massive fan revolt was the final nail in the coffin for the studio's stubbornness, proving it was never really about the angry letters alone. It was about the culture. The Dukes had become a national pastime, and removing one of its primary colours made the whole picture look dull and grey. The corporate suits finally woke up and smelled the coffee. James Best wasn't just some replaceable cog in their money-making machine. He was the absolute secret sauce that kept the entire chaotic production from grinding to a halt. The executives arrogantly thought they could swap him out like a flat tyre, but the market clapped back with a hard no. By the time the middle of the season rolled around, the network was frantically waving white flags in total surrender. The studio came crawling back to Best's representatives with a tone that was drastically different from the take-it-or-leave-it attitude they had months ago. They weren't just politely asking him to return. They were practically begging, asking what astronomical price it would take to lock him down forever. The underdog lawman had completely crushed the giants. He had survived the dry spell, outlasted the wannabe substitutes, and proved to the world that even in a show about a high-flying car, it's the charisma behind the wheel that keeps eyeballs on the screen. The bigwigs learned a brutal lesson the hard way. You can buy a fleet of flashy patrol cars, but you can't put a price tag on that iconic money-making cackle. Let's talk about the legendary little fat buddy pact between Best and Sorrel Book. While the nervous executives were sweating bullets over crashing Nielsen ratings, a scandalous little alliance was forming right on the front lines. To the average viewer, Rosco P, Coltrane and boss J.D. Hogg were just a pair of bumbling, incompetent crooks who couldn't find their own feet in a dark room. But turn off the cameras and the tea is piping hot. James Best and Sorrel Book were the intellectual heavyweights running the show, two geniuses sharing a juicy secret. They were both way too smart for the silly show they were filming, and honestly, they were loving every single second of fooling everyone. If James Best was the method acting wizard, Sorrel Book was his academic equal. Get this, Book was a classically trained thespian with a mastery of multiple languages and a prestigious degree from Yale on his wall. He had spent years crushing serious roles on stage before stuffing himself into a white suit and padding to play the gluttonous, greedy king of Hazzard. Whenever these two legends got together, the collective IQ on the set practically doubled instantly. They didn't look at the Dukes of Hazzard as just some mindless action flick. They saw it as their personal playground for a very specific, high-level form of comedic improv art. This deep bond was the foundation of the infamous Little Fat Buddy Pact. Early on, Best and Book realised the scripts they were handed were total garbage, serving only as flimsy excuses to get from one car jump to the next. To keep themselves from going absolutely insane with boredom and to give the fans something actually worth watching, they went rogue and started ad-libbing. Insiders estimate that nearly 80% of the hilarious banter between Rosco and Boss Hogg was created completely on the fly. They developed their own bizarre shorthand language of coos, giggles, and shade that felt like a massive inside joke the audience was just lucky enough to overhear. When Best famously stormed off the set in 1979, the person who took the hardest hit wasn't the director or the producers. It was Sorrel Book. Book found himself stranded in a total creative wasteland without his partner in crime. The replacement sheriffs were decent actors, sure, but they weren't playmates. They were boring squares who stuck to the script and waited for their cues like robots. They had absolutely no clue how to dance in the space between the lines or bring the magic. Book's performance during the Great Sheriff Drought shows a man who is technically present, but emotionally he had left the building. He desperately missed his comedic foil. He missed the man who would look him in the eye and let out a weird noise just to see if he could make Book break character on camera. It was this intense bond that fueled Best's leverage during the heated negotiations. Book didn't just want Best back for the show's ratings. He fought tooth and nail for him because he knew the set was a miserable lesser place without Best's high standards. The two actors shared a fiercely arrogant philosophy. Just because a show is for kids doesn't mean it has to be trash. They believed in the quality of the nonsense they were creating. If they were going to play fools, they were determined to be the absolute best fools in the business, and that required a level of professional respect the studio simply wasn't giving them. During the dramatic hiatus, the two stayed in constant contact. Book acted as a mole, keeping Best informed of the mounting chaos at the studio, and Best made it crystal clear that his fight wasn't just about a comfy chair. He was taking a massive stand for the entire cast. He saw how the heartthrobs John Schneider and Tom Wopat were being treated like disposable pin-ups. He saw the crew working impossible hours in the heat without any support. Best's demand for a dressing room with a shower and a decent place to sit became a symbol for a major power shift on the set. When the studio finally folded and invited Best back, the on-screen reunion between Rosco and Boss was way more than just a script requirement. It was a glorified victory lap for the rebels. The first time they filmed together after the walkout, the energy on set reportedly shifted instantly. The spark was back, baby. The ad-libs returned sharper, faster and meaner than before. They leaned into the little fat buddy nicknames with a brand new sense of ownership. They had proven once and for all that the human element was what sold the millions of lunchboxes, not the fiberglass car jumping over a dirty creek. This pact of solidarity set a massive precedent in Hollywood. A few years later, when Schneider and Wopat had their own legendary contract dispute and walkout, they did so with confidence, knowing the show had already blinked once when a lead actor stood his ground. Best had provided the ultimate blueprint for the Hazzard Rebellion. He showed everyone that in the face of a massive, soulless corporate machine, the only thing that actually matters is your willingness to say no and mean it. Forget the network politics and boardroom brawls. For Best and Book, the only thing that mattered was the art of the perfect punchline. They maintained a rock-solid friendship that transcended the industry drama right up until Book's tragic passing in 1994. James Best often described Book not merely as a co-star on the call sheet, but as his comedic soulmate, claiming their dynamic rivaled the legendary chemistry of Laurel and Hardy. Beneath the slapstick surface, these were two incredibly serious method actors who treated the business of playing the fool with the gravity of a Shakespearean performance. They formed a defensive alliance against the brutal daily grind of the Hollywood machine, creating a television brotherhood that managed to survive the mudslinging, the nasty lawsuits, and the cruel test of time. The bitter standoff finally crumbled, but let me tell you, the terms of that peace treaty were absolutely paved in gold. And that brings us to the complicated, heavy legacy behind that sheriff's badge. When James Best finally cruised back onto the Warner Brothers lot in 1980, he wasn't just clocking in for a shift, he was returning as the undisputed victor who made a major studio blink first. Waiting for him was the prize he'd fought tooth and nail for, a dressing room that actually respected his status, complete with a private shower and a chair that didn't look like it was salvaged from a hazardous scrapyard. But let's be real, this victory wasn't just about the plumbing or the furniture. It was about a massive shift in the atmosphere on set. The studio suits in the front office now had to look at the man in the tan uniform with a newfound, albeit slightly begrudging sense of respect. They finally woke up and realised that his signature cuckoo wasn't some cheap parlour trick. It was a trademarked asset that they simply couldn't clone. The grand return of Rosco P. Coltrane triggered a total creative renaissance for the show. Liberated from the toxicity of his previous working conditions, Best leaned all the way into the absurdity of the role. He even brought his own basset hound Flash into the mix, adding a layer of adorable canine chaos that somehow made the corrupt sheriff seem even more human. He and Sorrell Book absolutely doubled down on their unscripted madness, transforming the later seasons into a masterclass on how to steal a scene with physical comedy. The ratings levelled out, the fandom went wild, and for a few more glorious years, the sun over Hazzard County burned brighter than ever. But make no mistake, Best was an artist who never allowed a fictional badge to dictate his real-life boundaries. When the Dukes finally screeched across the finish line in 1985, he didn't stumble into that tragic where are they now pit that swallows up so many washed-up TV stars. You didn't catch him sitting around, bitter complaining to the tabloids about being typecast as a bumbling lawman for the rest of his life. Instead, he treated the cancellation of the show like a graduation ceremony ready to conquer the next chapter. He packed up for Florida, launched his own production powerhouse, and pivoted back to his original passion, schooling the next generation of actors. In his twilight years, Best reinvented himself as a celebrated painter, capturing the quiet serenity of the very southern landscapes he used to tear up in a police cruiser. He penned a tell-all memoir, sat in the director's chair, and continued to mentor young talent, drilling it into their heads that their dignity was never for sale. Through it all, he remained fiercely protectively loyal to his dysfunctional on-screen family. When he hit up fan conventions, he wasn't some desperate actor clinging to past glory. He was a patriarch celebrating a legacy, knowing full well his war was with the studio suits, never the fans. He genuinely adored the people who loved Rosco, and the legacy of James Best's Last Stand remains a quiet yet powerful landmark in Hollywood history. He proved that even when you're trapped inside a massive money-printing commercial juggernaut, a single actor has the power to demand basic human decency, completely debunking the studio myth that character actors are just disposable props. Today, when you see A-listers making headlines for standing their ground to demand better set conditions or fighting for creative control, they are walking down a path that James Best hacked through the Georgia brush way back in 1979. He left us in 2015 at the age of 88, but the ghostly echo of that wheezing laugh hasn't faded one bit. He left behind a filmography stretching from the golden age of cinema to the sitcom peak, but his absolute greatest performance wasn't something captured by a camera lens. It was that defining moment he climbed out of the mud, ripped off that badge, and walked away from $1 million paycheck just to prove a point about self-worth. In the final analysis, Rosco P. Coltrane wasn't just a goofy character on a screen. He was James Best's masterpiece of rebellion, a masterclass in standing your ground against the powers that be. The dirty little secret of Hazzard County had zero to do with boss hogs, crooked schemes, and everything to do with the ruthless reality of the Hollywood machine. James Best didn't stage a walkout because he hated the script, the screaming fans, or that iconic orange muscle car. He walked because he absolutely refused to let a multi-billion-dollar corporation treat a veteran artist like a piece of disposable rental equipment. In a town that usually measures a person's worth by their billing order on a call sheet, Best demanded a completely different metric. Basic, non-negotiable human dignity. His rebellion was a massive win for every character actor who's ever been told to change clothes in a drafty hallway or wash off in a freezing creek. Holding out for a shower didn't make him a diva. It made him a total pioneer for labour rights in showbiz. He taught the industry a hard lesson: the magic of a hit show isn't in the car stunts or the pyro, but in the heart and humour of the people we invite into our living rooms every single week. Today we might nostalgically remember the epic jumps and the high-speed chases. But the true soul of that series lived in that ridiculous improvised giggle and the electric chemistry between two brilliant men sitting in a white Cadillac. James Best eventually got his fancy dressing room, sure, but he gave the rest of us something far more valuable than entertainment. It serves as a brutal high-stakes wake-up call to Tinseltown that no matter how obsessively the fans worship the character you portray, you absolutely must possess the self-respect to demand your worth and refuse to back down when the cameras stop rolling. As the golden hour fades over the scandalous fictional backroads of Hazzard County, one can almost picture that infamous patrol car vanishing into a thick cloud of dust and industry secrets one last time. It seems the badge-wearing lawman ultimately secured the final victory, and let me tell you, this shocking twist was definitely not found in any writer's screenplay. This was pure, unadulterated reality. The legendary James Best proved to the world that even the man behind the clumsy, bumbling sheriff knew exactly when to flip the script stop, taking commands from the executives, and ruthlessly fight for his dignity. If you live for this juicy deep dive into the chaotic history of Hazzard and crave more behind-the-scenes tea, make sure you smash that follow button right now to stay in the loop. We are digging up even more shocking untold secrets and scandalous revelations from the glittering golden age of television that the studios tried to bury.